Yo, today we reppin' Bigfoot out here. We getting Bigfoot up in this. This is quite the video that we have here today. I was not expecting to make this video today. I did not wake up this morning going, hey, you know what would be cool to make a video about? Monsters. Obviously. It seems almost a little off-brand, but writing it kinda is under the umbrella of what I do here, so like, I don't know. I do what I want. Why am I making a video about riding monsters? Well, let me tell you. Today I was watching a lot of videos about different mythologies and different mythological or folklore or cryptid monsters. It got me to do a lot of thinking in the brain, a lot of churning of like butter. So I had some ideas and I compiled them and I want to talk about them here. There are some videos on the internet about creating monsters, some videos about writing villains and horror, which are all kind of similar and could give you a pretty good idea of how to write monsters. But what I'm here to add to that pool of writing information are some ideas on specifically writing monsters, what makes them terrifying, and how you can make monsters feel more integrated into whatever story you're writing. Because whatever story you are writing, even if it's like a fantasy where you're on a whole other world, or it's just on Earth and it's very grounded and it's very secret kind of monster, there are still things you want to consider and still world building that has to be done. There is one thing that I think most people are pretty familiar with when it comes to writing advice when it comes to this kind of thing. But there's another thing that I thought of today that I don't know if we really think too much about, but could be really helpful in theory. Because both of these things fall under the category of the fear of the unknown. Now, the fear of the unknown is kind of a broad concept, I feel. And that's kind of in its nature, right? The unknown. Obviously, it's bound to be broad. But I mean specifically when I say that, broad in the sense of how it's applied as well. I've thought of at least two ways this can be applied when it comes to writing a monster or any sort of horror, really. The first thing I want to talk about on this subject is the fear of the unknown as far as capability goes. So this is specifically, I think, what most people think of when they talk about fear of the unknown. What's looming in the shadows? Or there's this mysterious thing. We don't know if this monster can teleport. We don't know if this monster can read your mind. We don't know if this monster vomits jelly beans in the middle of the night. I don't see why that one would be all that scary, but you know, it's a possibility that we are unsure of. All of that is very interesting, and I think a lot of people are pretty well versed in describing that and in giving advice on that. But I thought of kind of another way. This comes from an understanding of understanding how humans work. If the antagonist of your horror story is a human, then you know what they're capable of. Generally, there's a limit to what a human can do. Maybe there's some space, right, where they're very skilled, they're very talented, or they're very crazy, and so it's hard to predict them. But when it comes to a human, you know that they're not just gonna vomit jelly beans because that's a power they have, right? You know that they're not gonna be running at light speed or anything. You understand that there is a limit to what they can do. So how do you keep that fear of the unknown? And that's where I began to consider the fear of an unknown outcome. This, I think, is specifically good for writing a thriller story, but also applies to horror. Horror and thriller are very similar, very one and the same in a lot of ways. Let's use the example of approaching a bear to describe this, because we generally have a pretty good idea of what bears are capable of. We know that they're super strong and super fast, at least as far as humans go. We know that if we approach a bear, it could just whack us and we would be dead. Just dead. Big ripperonis for us. Ripperonis, and more like ribbons, because we would be sliced apart. Like, a bear can destroy a human pretty well. And even though we may have like the proper tools and the proper like knowledge and everything we need to hunt a bear, going for that is still going to be scary, because what if you mess up? If everything goes according to plan, then we'll succeed. But what if it doesn't? Right? What kind of fear does that draw in us, right? And that's a suspense that's very interesting to explore. And it can even be a pushing factor in a story sometimes, which can be even more interesting, but not necessarily always does it have to be like that. But even if you're tackling a monster that is already pretty well known, or that you already know the limits of, there's always still going to be that fear of what happens when you mess up. And that's something that's so human, and something that we could probably explore more of. I also started to think about different types of monsters you see often, whether it's like mythology or folklore, or like strange cryptid sightings, or if it's like a story. I noticed that I find that they typically fall under about 3-ish categories. Maybe one, maybe 2 of them are more one the same, but bear with me here. The first one of these things I want to talk about is the fear of control. When I think of examples for this, I think of shows like Stranger Things. There's this certain element and this certain fear of the show that comes specifically from a very human standpoint. The monsters and all the fear is a very sciencey fear. It's a very sci-fi horror, if you will. A lot of the scary things in the show were made by people. They were made by people, or they wouldn't have been known unless people hadn't gone digging for it. I guess a more fantasy version of this would be in the Mines of Moria in Lord of the Rings, where the dwarves dug so deep because of their greed that they discovered a terrifying monster. And the monster would have stayed covered and wouldn't have hurt anyone if it weren't for the fact that the dwarves dug down and they kept going, and they caused it to happen. And then there's a fear of being unable to control things, right? Because while the fear of control explores a very human standpoint and a very corrupt human part of everything, the fear of being out of control is often more something kind of supernatural, I find. I think the most classic, most perfect example would be Lovecraftian horror, where all of the horror is very mind-blowing and very like, this is just a really bad and unlucky day for me because this monster has just shown up and I can't even comprehend the existence of it. But I think this also goes for things like a dragon just shows up and burns your village down just because that's the nature of the dragon. Really sucks to be you today, but your village is gone and there was absolutely nothing you could have ever done about it. There is nothing you did to bring it. It's just an unfortunate part of life. And then there was one that I thought of literally as I'm recording this now, which is a fear of destiny, right? Because it's something that's out of your control, but sometimes that destiny is shaped by something you did. There's a story in the King Arthur legends about one of his knights who gets approached by this Green Knight. I think the Green Knight actually approaches King Arthur, but whatever. The knight takes the opportunity, I guess. He is told by this Green Knight, you can hit me wherever you'd like, but in 1 year I'm going to hit you the exact same way. Due to the pressure, the knight cuts off the Green Knight's head. Now this knight has to go through the next year understanding that he's about to have his head cut off. That's the closest thing I can think of to a monster under this category. I'm sure people who are more well versed in like horror and stuff might be able to think of some examples. Maybe some people can even think of some fantasy examples, but that's just one idea I had. Maybe there's no precedent for that. I don't know. But it's kind of this in-between of like, it could be taken from the point where there was a little bit of control, but now it's out of control, right? Determining what you might want to do, what kind of monster you should make in this category, I think would just depend on what the theme of your story is. And I think if you understand the theme of your story, then what kind of monster will make more sense. So I was watching these videos, and the biggest thing that made me want to make this video about doing all this research today was I was thinking specifically about American folklore, because obviously I'm American, and I was learning about these different cryptids and monsters, and I was just thinking, like, it's the modern day. It's 2023. We have so many cameras. We have such well-developed science, and yet we still can't truly prove whether or not these different monsters exist. It's so strange to me, and it kind of reshaped the way that I'm thinking of how monsters would work in a fantasy world or sci-fi world, or even a grounded in our Earth world, but there's like one monster. And when it comes to world building and bringing in monsters into a story, you have to ask yourself a lot of questions in that regard. Some questions that I wrote down as kind of like I should keep that in mind when I'm creating monsters in a world. How common are the sightings? How many of them are there? Is it like they reproduce a lot and like they can have their own like pack societies and stuff? If there is only one of them, where does it come from? Why is there only one? How is their existence seen by society? Is this like a regular part of life? Is this monster seen the same way as like a bear is seen? Like, I'm terrified of bears, right? Obviously I wouldn't want to be around a wild bear, and especially one that's mad at me, but like, it's also not what I would necessarily consider a monster, because it's just such a common idea. There's so many pictures, and there's so many, like, you can prove that a bear is real. I would love to see people, however, make conspiracy theories about how bears aren't real, and see if they can actually convince like some old boomer or something to believe that bears actually aren't real. Maybe that will be easier to do once Gen Z is super old, because, you know, Gen Z never leaves their bedrooms. But these questions are just a couple of examples of the kinds of questions you would want to ask yourself when making a monster and putting them into a world. And you don't have to reveal all these questions in your story, right? Sometimes having these questions unknown just makes the monster more interesting and more exciting, and sometimes answering the questions can kind of be unwanted, but it's good to have in your mind a lot of these answers. Sometimes it's good to have these questions answered in your mind so that you're not left with these plot holes in your world building, which isn't always a bad thing to have, but it's something you definitely want to be aware of and make sure that you're not just throwing things around willy-nilly. There are plot holes in real life, in Earth history, that we can't really explain at all. It's something you want to consider, and especially if your story has a huge focus on monsters, then that's really something you want to keep in mind and understand that you know, these are questions that you may want to have in the back of your mind so that you can have an easier time writing them. So now that I'm getting more rambly than anything else, I'm gonna call it quits here. I hope this writing advice has helped you. I'm definitely gonna be trying it hopefully at some point. But if you want to see me put my money where my mouth is, if you want to see me try and practice making some sort of story revolving around a monster, well, joke's on you. You already can. I have a second channel. There's only one video on there. I hope to make more content for it, but this channel is my big priority right now, so no promises on making videos on the second channel. But I wrote a fairy tale, and I'll have a link in the description, maybe a card thing up here if I can do that. I don't know if I can. But this is a fairy tale I wrote about 2 years ago, and it's heavily inspired by stories like Peter Pan and just in general fairy tales. I was getting pretty interested in like the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and I wanted to try my own hand at making something like that for worlds that I create. If you found any of this helpful, then be sure to leave a like. Be sure to leave a comment. Let me know if you want more writing advice. Let me know if there's specific writing advice that you have not been able to find on the internet. Maybe I won't know the answers, but I can certainly give it a try. However, if you're not interested in writing, I hope you still enjoyed this video, and I hope you still were able to find something interesting to learn about it. And be sure to subscribe, because I still plan on making really epic content like this. And with that, don't get eaten by a chupacabra tonight. Otherwise, I'll have to put you down.